The first time I heard from the Ho about my cabin, it was through a letter that arrived in a plain white envelope with their logo printed neatly in the corner. I didn't think much of it when I pulled it out of the mailbox. I figured it was one of those generic notices they sometimes send out, the kind that talks about holiday decorations or trash pickup reminders. After all, my main home was inside the community where the Ho had some reach. But the cabin, that was a different story entirely. The cabin wasn't even close to our neighborhood. It was nearly 45 minutes away, tucked deep into a wooded hillside on land I had inherited from my grandfather. He had built the place back in the 70s with his own two hands, stacking logs, cutting timber, and laying down stone for the fireplace. It was small, rustic, and imperfect, but it was ours. And most importantly, it was far beyond any line on a map that had anything to do with my neighborhood Ho. So imagine my surprise when I opened the letter and read, "Notice of fine, $30,000. Property in violation of Ho standards and noncompliance with approved construction guidelines." I almost laughed at first. They couldn't be serious. I looked at the date, the letterhead, the signature of the board president. Everything about it was written in that bureaucratic, self-important tone that HOAs love to use. But my first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. I called my neighbor, Peter, who happened to serve on the HOA's landscaping committee. He was a friendly enough guy, someone who mowed his lawn every 2 days and took pride in having the greenest grass on the block. "Pete," I said, "you're not going to believe what I just got in the mail." When I told him, there was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then he chuckled nervously. "That has to be a mistake. They don't have jurisdiction out there, man. Everyone knows that. The whole rules stop at the edge of our subdivision." "That's what I thought," I said. "But they put it in writing. $30,000. He whistled low. "You better come to the next board meeting. They'll have to clear it up." So that's what I did. The board meetings were always held in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. About 30 people usually showed up, most of them retirees who had plenty of time on their hands to debate the color of fences and the height of hedges. I showed up with a letter in hand, determined to settle the matter quickly. When my turn came to speak, I stood up, held the letter high, and said, "I received this notice in the mail. It says the Ho is fining me $30,000 for a property you don't even control. My cabin is outside this neighborhood, outside this county line even. I want this off my record immediately." You'd think they would have responded with confusion, maybe embarrassment at the error. Instead, the board president, a woman named Marjorie with tightly curled hair and a permanent scowl, adjusted her glasses and said, "The whole board has determined that your cabin negatively impacts the aesthetic values of our community members, some of whom drive past the road leading to it. Therefore, it falls under our extended jurisdiction." I blinked. I thought I misheard her. Extended jurisdiction? That's not a thing. You don't get to extend your reach just because some people drive past a road. My cabin is on private land. It has nothing to do with this Ho. Murmurs filled the room. Some neighbors nodded in agreement with me, while others frowned as if I had broken some sacred code. Marjorie raised her hand for silence. "The fine stands. If you wish to dispute it, you may submit an appeal in writing to the compliance committee. Until then, the amount will continue to accrue interest." I felt my blood pressure spike. Accrue interest? On what authority? This is harassment. But Marjorie simply looked past me to the next item on the agenda, as if I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of me, staring at the numbers, at the legal jargon, at the smugness that seemed to ooze from the page. $30,000. For nothing. For a cabin outside their reach. I thought about my grandfather, about the weekends we spent fishing near that cabin, about the way he used to tell me, "Land is freedom. Don't ever let anyone tell you what to do on your land." He had worked too hard for me to let a group of overreaching neighbors bully me into submission. The next morning, I called an attorney. His name was Daniel Price, a sharp-eyed, quick-talking man in his 40s who had dealt with plenty of Ho disputes before. When I laid out the situation, he leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and let out a low laugh. "They've really overplayed their hand this time," he said. "They have no legal authority beyond the subdivision. None. This fine is bogus. If they want to push it, they're opening themselves up to some serious consequences." "Like what?" I asked. "Like you suing them for harassment, abuse of power, and potentially fraud if they're trying to collect money they're not entitled to. We can take this to court, and I'm confident you'd win." It was the first real relief I'd felt since the letter arrived. Still, the idea of going to war with the wasn't something I relished. I'd lived in this neighborhood for years. I knew these people. We had block parties, exchanged holiday cards. But now things felt different. Daniel gave me some advice. Document everything. Every letter, every email, every meeting. Don't engage with them directly. Let me handle the communication. And whatever you do, don't pay them a cent. So, that's what I did. But the HOA wasn't backing down. Over the next few weeks, I received 2 more letters, one demanding immediate payment and another threatening to place a lien on my main home if I didn't comply. A lien on the house where my wife and kids lived, where we built our lives. All because of a cabin they had no right to control. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a simple misunderstanding. This was a power play. They wanted to scare me, to bully me into paying up. And I decided then and there, I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to fight back. The first lawsuit notice didn't come from me. It came from them. The HOA filed an official claim with the county clerk's office, stating that I owed them $30,000 in fines plus accumulated fees. They listed the supposed violations: unauthorized structure, visual disharmony with community standards, and failure to comply with HOA construction bylaws. Reading through it, I felt like I had stepped into some twisted alternate reality. None of those bylaws applied to my cabin. The bylaws themselves, as Daniel later showed me, specifically referenced properties within the boundaries of Lakeside Ridge subdivision. My cabin was 45 minutes away, up a gravel road in a different township. Yet there it was, filed in black and white. Daniel, my attorney, was almost giddy when I brought him the paperwork. "This is better than I expected," he said, flipping through the pages with a grin. "They've made a fatal mistake. By filing this, they've dragged the court system into something they can't possibly win. It's harassment on a documented level now." But I wasn't smiling. I had neighbors knocking on my door, whispering about how the board was calling me a community violator. Word was spreading fast that I was some kind of troublemaker who refused to play by the rules. Marjorie, the board president, even had the nerve to bring it up at the next meeting in front of everyone. She stood behind the podium, speaking in that clipped, authoritative tone of hers. "We must all do our part to maintain the standards of our neighborhood. When individuals build unsightly or unauthorized structures, even outside our borders, it reflects poorly on us all. It lowers our property values. It sends the wrong message." Several people clapped. Others looked uneasy, shifting in their chairs. I sat in the back, arms crossed, listening to the character assassination unfold. When it was time for public comments, I stood. "For the record," I said, voice steady, "my cabin is on private land outside of Lakeside Ridge. This board has no jurisdiction there. What you're doing is illegal. And I promise you, it will not stand." You could hear a pin drop after that. Marjorie gave me a thin smile, the kind of smile that said, "We'll see about that." The weeks that followed were like a Cold War. Letters piled up in my mailbox. Some were official HOA notices. Others were snide little anonymous notes scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Stop embarrassing our neighborhood," or "Pay up and quit dragging us down." My kids came home from school asking why people were whispering about their dad. My wife tried to shield them, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Is this really worth it?" she asked one night as we sat on the porch. "They're making our lives miserable." "It's not just about the money," I told her. "It's about the principle. If they can get away with this, what's next? Are they going to start fining people for how their relatives' houses look? For where they go on vacation? They have to be stopped." She nodded, though reluctantly. She knew my stubborn streak. I wasn't backing down. Daniel filed our countersuit a few days later. Harassment, abuse of authority, attempted fraud. He also filed an injunction to stop them from placing any liens until the matter was settled in court. That bought us some breathing room. But the HOA board doubled down. They hired their own attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Caldwell who strutted into the first pre-trial hearing like he owned the place. He carried a leather briefcase and wore cufflinks that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. Caldwell argued that the HOA had implied jurisdiction over properties that impacted the visual and reputational character of the subdivision. He actually said those words with a straight face. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss the case outright. Instead, he scheduled a hearing to review evidence from both sides. That meant discovery. That meant depositions. That meant this nightmare was far from over. In the meantime, I decided to visit the cabin, partly to clear my head, partly to remind myself what I was fighting for. Driving up that winding gravel road, seeing the tall pines sway in the mountain breeze, smelling the earthy scent of moss and wood smoke, it grounded me. This was my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the memories wash over me. The creak of the floorboards, the stone fireplace with soot still blackened from old fires, the shelves lined with fishing gear, and my grandfather's battered coffee mugs. It was simple, yes, rustic, maybe even rough around the edges, but it was honest. I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and pink. "They're not taking this from me," I muttered. "Not now, not ever." A few days later, Daniel called me with a revelation. "You're going to love this," he said. I got hold of the HOA's internal emails through discovery. Turns out, Marjorie's whole crusade started because she personally drove past your cabin while visiting her sister in the next county. She called it an eyesore and said it made her ashamed to tell people she lived in Lakeside Ridge. That's when she convinced the board to fine you. I felt my jaw tighten. So this wasn't about rules or property values. It was about one woman's ego. One woman who thought she could stretch her little kingdom beyond its borders. Daniel chuckled darkly. This is gold in court. It shows bias, personal vendetta, abuse of power. She just handed us ammunition. But before we could get to court, things escalated further. One morning, I came outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It wasn't from the county or the city. It was from the HOA. Final warning. Non-payment of fines. Immediate lien proceedings to commence. They had ignored the injunction. They were going rogue. My wife found me standing there, fists clenched, staring at the paper. "What do we do now?" she asked. I tore it down, crumpled it in my hand, and said, "Now? Now we fight harder." That weekend, Daniel organized a community meeting, not an HOA one, but an independent gathering in the park. He invited every homeowner in Lakeside Ridge, promising to reveal the truth about what the board was doing. Nearly 50 people showed up. Some were curious, others angry, a few skeptical. I stood beside Daniel as he laid out the facts. The bogus fine, the lack of jurisdiction, the emails proving Marjorie's vendetta. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man shouted, "So we're paying dues for them to waste money on this nonsense?" Another woman said, "I never agreed to sue people outside our neighborhood." Faces turned toward me. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and spoke. "I'm not asking for sympathy," I said. "I'm asking for fairness. This isn't just about me. If they can target my cabin, what's to stop them from targeting you? What's to stop them from fining you for things they personally don't like, even if it has nothing to do with our bylaws? This board has overstepped, and unless we stop them, they'll keep going." The applause was louder than I expected. Not everyone clapped, but enough did that I saw doubt flicker in their eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt momentum shift. When the HOA board got wind of the meeting, they were furious. Marjorie called me a rabble-rouser in the community newsletter. Caldwell filed a motion to dismiss our countersuit, claiming we were wasting court resources, but the judge denied it. The case was officially heading to trial. As I sat in the courtroom weeks later, staring at the polished wood benches and the state seal looming above the judge's chair, I realized this was bigger than just me versus an hoe. This was about boundaries, about freedom, about standing up when someone in power thinks they can bulldoze you just because they wear a title. The judge entered, the bailiff called the court to order, and the battle truly began. The first day of trial felt surreal. I had been in courtrooms before, for jury duty, for traffic tickets, but never as the central figure in a case that seemed to carry the weight of my entire neighborhood on its shoulders. The courthouse was an old stone building, its steps worn smooth by decades of people climbing them in search of justice, or at least resolution. I arrived early with Daniel, my attorney. He carried a stack of files under one arm and a quiet confidence that reassured me, even as my nerves twisted my stomach. My wife walked with us, her hand in mine, steady but tense. She was here to support me, but I knew the anxiety weighed heavy on her. Inside the courtroom, I spotted Marjorie sitting at the plaintiff's table with Caldwell, their lawyer. She wore a sharp navy blazer and pearl earrings, her posture straight, chin lifted as if she were the queen of the Ho Empire. The other board members, 3 men and 1 woman, sat in the row behind her, whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting in my direction like I was some sort of criminal. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Harrington, entered promptly at 9. Her voice carried authority when she announced, "This court is now in session." Caldwell rose first, delivering his opening statement with polished charm. He painted the Ho as protectors of community harmony, claiming that my cabin, though outside the subdivision, was a visible blight impacting the reputation and property values of Lakeside Ridge residents. He spoke as though my little log cabin were a toxic waste site. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood with deliberate calm, letting the silence stretch for a moment before he began. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of community protection. It's a case of overreach. The Ho is attempting to exert control over property they have no legal jurisdiction over. My client's cabin sits outside their boundaries, outside their bylaws, outside their authority. Yet they fined him $30,000. Not because of any legitimate rule violation, but because one member of the board decided she didn't like how it looked. This case is about abuse of power." His words landed like hammer blows. I saw a few jurors nod slightly, their eyes narrowing toward Marjorie. The first witnesses were members of the Ho board. Caldwell called them one by one, trying to build a case that the cabin somehow impacted the subdivision. One board member, a balding man named Greg, testified, "When I drive to visit my sister, I pass by the turnoff near his cabin. It looks out of place. It doesn't fit the aesthetic we work hard to maintain in Lakeside Ridge." Daniel's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Simmons, are you aware that the Ho bylaws specifically limit jurisdiction to properties within the subdivision's mapped boundaries?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but—" "No further questions," Daniel cut in, the point made. Another board member, Carol, admitted under questioning that she had never even seen the cabin. She was simply voting based on what Marjorie told her. That drew audible murmurs from the jury box. By the time Marjorie herself took the stand, Caldwell's carefully crafted narrative was starting to unravel. She held her chin high, answering questions with clipped precision. But when Daniel stood to cross-examine, her composure began to crack. "Mrs. Blake," Daniel began, "is it true that you first raised the issue of my client's cabin after personally driving past it?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And you described it in an email to the board as, let me quote directly, an eyesore that makes me embarrassed to tell people I live in Lakeside Ridge?" Her lips tightened. "That was a private remark. It was an official Ho email," Daniel corrected. "And you used that personal opinion to justify fining my client $30,000, did you not?" "I acted in the best interest of the community," she snapped. Daniel leaned closer, his voice steady. "Even though the cabin lies outside your community, even though your bylaws clearly stop at the subdivision's edge. Isn't it true, Mrs. Blake, that this fine was less about rules and more about your personal dislike of how the cabin looked?" For the first time, Marjorie faltered. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Caldwell, then back to Daniel. I wouldn't put it that way. But you can't deny it, can you? Daniel pressed. The silence that followed was louder than any admission. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke from the heart. I described the history of the cabin, how my grandfather built it, how it was a place of family memories and peace. I explained how stunned I was to receive a fine for a property outside HOA control, how the letters escalated into threats, and how the board ignored even a legal injunction to stop harassing me. I'm not here because I don't want to follow rules, I told the jury. I follow the HOA guidelines for my home in Lakeside Ridge, just like everyone else. But this isn't about rules. This is about power. And if they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone. I saw heads nodding again. I saw empathy in their eyes. During recess, whispers rippled through the courtroom hallways. Residents from Lakeside Ridge had shown up to watch the trial, and the mood was shifting. Some who had once sided with the board now muttered about how reckless and arrogant Marjorie looked under cross-examination. One neighbor, Mrs. Hill, pulled me aside and whispered, "I never realized how far she'd gone. We trusted her. We thought she was protecting the neighborhood. But this is too much." Her words gave me hope. The most dramatic moment came when Daniel introduced the internal HOA emails into evidence. He displayed them on a projector, line by line, for the jury to see. Marjorie's words glared from the screen. "That ugly cabin doesn't belong anywhere near our community. If we let this slide, who knows what else will spring up around us? Trailers? Shacks? It's embarrassing. We need to take action and make an example of him." The room buzzed. Even Caldwell looked momentarily rattled, tugging at his cufflinks as the weight of the words sank in. Judge Harrington rapped her gavel for order, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the truth. This wasn't about bylaws or community standards. This was a vendetta. By the end of the first week, it was clear the HOA's case was crumbling. Their own witnesses had admitted overreach. Their president's bias was on display. And their legal foundation, that implied jurisdiction nonsense, was nothing but smoke and mirrors. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He requested the chance to bring in expert testimony about property values, hoping to convince the jury that my cabin, rustic as it was, somehow lowered values in Lakeside Ridge. The so-called expert, a real estate appraiser, took the stand and tried to argue that unsightly nearby structures could diminish neighborhood appeal. But under Daniel's questioning, he admitted he had never appraised a property in our area, had never visited my cabin, and was being paid generously by the HOA for his testimony. The jurors weren't buying it. Outside the courtroom, the battle spilled back into the neighborhood. HOA newsletters painted me as reckless, uncooperative, even dangerous to community unity. Meanwhile, more and more residents began questioning where their dues were going. Rumors spread that the board had spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees to fight me, money that should have gone to landscaping, pool maintenance, or playground repairs. One evening, as I walked to get the mail, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me. "You're standing up for all of us," he said quietly. "Don't let them win." His words fueled me. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about accountability. As the second week of trial began, Daniel leaned over to me at our table and whispered, "We've got them cornered. Now we go for the knockout." I nodded, heart pounding, ready for whatever came next. Because this fight wasn't just about a $30,000 fine anymore. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the HOA board and making sure they finally faced consequences. The courthouse atmosphere shifted as the trial entered its second week. What had started as a case about a single cabin fine had become a spectacle. Reporters from the local paper sat in the gallery, scribbling notes. Residents of Lakeside Ridge showed up in increasing numbers, filling benches, whispering heatedly as testimony unfolded. Some came to support me. Others came to glare from behind Marjorie, like soldiers behind their general. Judge Harrington, stern but fair, made it clear she wouldn't tolerate theatrics. Yet even she couldn't stop the drama from bubbling through every word, every piece of evidence. It was on the third day of testimony in week 2 that everything cracked wide open. Daniel had subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, something Caldwell fought tooth and nail to suppress. But the judge allowed it, and when the documents arrived, Daniel spent hours combing through them with his paralegal. What he found was dynamite. The next morning, Daniel stood, a stack of papers in hand. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light that not only undermines the plaintiff's case, but reveals potential misconduct within the Lakeside Ridge HOA board itself." Marjorie stiffened. Caldwell immediately objected, but Judge Harrington waved him down. "Let's hear it." Daniel walked to the projector and placed the first page under the lens. Numbers filled the screen: dues collected, expenditures, legal fees. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said to the jury, "the HOA claims it is protecting the interests of its members. Yet these records show over $75,000 of community funds have been spent on this lawsuit alone against one homeowner for a cabin outside their jurisdiction." Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel flipped to another page. "And it gets worse. These disbursements were authorized without community vote. No disclosure in meeting minutes. No transparency. In fact," he clicked to the next page, highlighting a line item. "Payments were made directly to a private consulting company, owned by none other than Mrs. Blake's cousin." All eyes snapped to Marjorie. Her face flushed crimson. "That's a conflict of interest," Daniel said firmly. "Money from homeowners' dues funneled to relatives under the guise of fighting a battle that was never legally theirs to fight. This isn't just overreach. This is corruption." The room erupted. Residents in the gallery shouted, some calling for answers, others demanding Marjorie resign on the spot. The bailiff had to call for order while Judge Harrington banged her gavel repeatedly. Marjorie sat frozen, her jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the table as if willing herself to disappear. Caldwell whispered furiously in her ear, but the damage was done. During cross-examination, Daniel pressed Marjorie again. "Mrs. Blake, did you authorize these payments to your cousin's company?" I don't recall every expenditure," she stammered. "Let me refresh your memory." Daniel slid a document across to her. "That's your signature, is it not?" She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "So you personally approved these payments without informing homeowners, without a vote, while simultaneously pursuing a baseless fine against my client." Her composure cracked. "I did what I thought was best for the community," she snapped. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Or did you do what was best for yourself?" That question hung in the air like a blade. The trial spilled into the evening that day, with residents buzzing furiously in the hallways. Some were outraged at Marjorie's actions, others embarrassed they had trusted her leadership. A few diehards still defended her, muttering about how rules are rules, but their voices were drowned out by the tide turning against the board. At home that night, I felt the weight of what had happened. My wife sat across from me at the kitchen table, shaking her head. I knew she was power-hungry, but stealing from the neighborhood? That's a whole new level. "It's not just about me anymore," I said quietly. "This could dismantle the whole board." She reached for my hand. "Maybe that's what needs to happen." The next morning, the HOA's lawyer tried to regain control. Caldwell strutted in with his usual polished arrogance, but I noticed sweat beading on his temple. His opening words betrayed cracks in his composure. "Your Honor, while the defense would like to paint this as corruption, the fact remains. The HOA has the duty to maintain community standards. The payments in question are irrelevant to the matter at hand." But Judge Harrington wasn't buying it. "Mr. Caldwell, the financial integrity of the HOA is very much relevant, especially if funds were misused to pursue a case outside their jurisdiction. This court will not ignore that." Caldwell sat down, his jaw tight. As the trial continued, Daniel brought forward witnesses from within the community, neighbors who had grown disillusioned with the board. One elderly woman testified, voice trembling with both nerves and anger. "We pay our dues for landscaping, pool upkeep, repairs. Not for this circus. Not for them to line their pockets." Another resident, a young father, said bluntly, "I don't even care about the cabin. I care that my HOA fees are being wasted while our playground equipment rusts. This board is out of control." Their voices carried weight. These weren't outsiders. These were the very people the Ho claimed to represent. By midweek, I began to notice fractures forming among the board members themselves. During recess, I caught sight of Carol, the board treasurer, pacing the hallway, her face pale. She avoided Marjorie's gaze, whispering instead with one of the other members. That night, Daniel received a call from her attorney. Carol wanted to testify for the defense. The following day, Carol took the stand. Her voice wavered at first, but soon gained strength as she revealed what had been happening behind closed doors. Mrs. Blake pressured us to approve the fine, Carol admitted. She told us if we didn't, we were letting down the neighborhood. She controlled the meetings, shut down dissent, and pushed through expenditures without transparency. When I questioned the legality of finding a cabin outside our subdivision, she told me to keep quiet or resign. The courtroom was silent, every eye locked on her. She said we needed to set an example of Mr. Thompson, Carol continued, glancing at me. That if we didn't act, the community would see us as weak. I regret not speaking up sooner. I should have. Her testimony was devastating. Even the jurors looked shaken. By the end of the day, Marjorie looked less like a queen on her throne and more like a trapped animal, her empire crumbling around her. Caldwell fought desperately to control the narrative, objecting at every turn, but Judge Harrington's patience wore thin. At one point, she leaned over the bench and said sharply, "Mr. Caldwell, if your client continues to obstruct this court with evasions, sanctions will be considered." The gavel of authority was coming down, and it wasn't on my head. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. Residents began circulating petitions to remove the board. Small groups gathered in driveways and at the poolside, whispering about audits, about replacements, about taking their community back. My kids came home from school to find neighbors bringing casseroles and cookies to our doorstep as a show of support. It was strange after weeks of isolation. Suddenly, we weren't alone. But I also knew the fight wasn't over. Marjorie wasn't the type to go down quietly, and Caldwell wasn't finished with his tricks. One evening, as I reviewed notes with Daniel, he leaned back and rubbed his chin. "She's desperate. That makes her dangerous. Don't be surprised if they try something dramatic before the verdict." I frowned. "Like what?" He didn't answer directly. "Let's just say, when people like Marjorie feel power slipping through their fingers, they do reckless things." I didn't know it then, but he was right. The trial still had twists left, twists that would drag the entire Ho board into deeper scandal than anyone imagined. The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch after Carol's testimony. It wasn't just my fight anymore. The community was split, the Ho board was fracturing, and the trial had become the center of attention across the county. The local news ran nightly updates, their anchors using words like power abuse and community corruption scandal. Marjorie, once the iron-fisted queen of Lakeside Ridge, now sat at the plaintiff's table with her shoulders stiff, her once proud chin quivering slightly as reporters snapped photos of her entering and leaving the courthouse. Caldwell looked more strained each day, his polished swagger dimming under the weight of mounting losses. But Daniel warned me. Cornered animals bite the hardest. Expect something soon. He wasn't wrong. It started with a motion Caldwell filed late one evening. Daniel called me as I was putting my kids to bed. His voice was tight. "They're trying to have the case dismissed again," he said. "On what grounds?" I asked. "On the claim that your countersuit is vindictive harassment designed to smear the board. They're also trying to seal the financial records we revealed, calling them confidential home matters." My blood boiled. They can't just bury the evidence. Daniel sighed. That's their move. They're hoping the judge caves, or at least delays the trial until residents lose interest. We'll fight it, but be ready. They're playing dirty now. Sure enough, the next morning, Caldwell strutted into court with a stack of new motions, speaking quickly about protecting the privacy of the Ho and irrelevance of certain documents. But Judge Harrington wasn't swayed. "Mr. Caldwell," she said sharply, "this court does not exist to protect private embarrassment. Financial mismanagement tied directly to this case is relevant, admissible, and will not be hidden." Her gavel slammed down. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Marjorie looked like she had been slapped. The trial rolled forward. That afternoon, the defense called a surprise witness, a former HOA board secretary named Helen. She was a quiet, silver-haired woman with kind eyes, the sort who looked like she should be baking cookies instead of testifying in a high-stakes courtroom. But her words cut like knives. "I resigned from the board last year," she explained, "because I couldn't stomach the way things were run. Marjorie controlled everything, agendas, votes, even the minutes. If someone disagreed, she rewrote the record to make it look unanimous. She treated the HOA like her personal kingdom." Daniel leaned forward. "Mrs. Collins, did you ever see discussions about the defendant's cabin?" "Yes," Helen said, nodding firmly. "Marjorie pushed it harder than anything else. She said it was about sending a message that the HOA's authority extended wherever she wanted it to. The others went along because they were afraid of her." The gallery erupted again. Residents shifted uncomfortably, whispering in shock. Some glared at Marjorie. Others looked embarrassed, as though complicit just by having believed in her. Caldwell tried to shake Helen's credibility, but she stood her ground, her voice unwavering. By the time she stepped down, Marjorie's empire was crumbling even faster. Outside the courthouse, I could feel the shift in public opinion. Reporters who once treated me like the stubborn homeowner who refused to play by the rules now swarmed me with sympathetic questions. "Do you feel vindicated?" one asked as microphones pressed forward. I kept my tone calm. "This was never about me alone. It's about protecting everyone from abuse of power. I'm just glad the truth is coming out." Behind me, Marjorie pushed past reporters with Caldwell shielding her, barking "no comment" to every question. Cameras flashed as residents shouted, "Shame!" The tide had turned. But Daniel was right about one thing: cornered animals bite. 2 nights later, while I was at the cabin trying to escape the chaos, headlights appeared at the bottom of the gravel drive. I frowned. Visitors were rare up here, especially after dark. A black SUV rolled slowly up the hill and stopped in front of the cabin. The windows were tinted. For a moment, no one got out. Then the driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped into the moonlight. It was Marjorie. My stomach clenched. She walked up the porch steps, her heels crunching on the wood. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, sounded strained. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms. "I don't think there's anything left to say." Her eyes glimmered, not with anger this time, but with desperation. "You don't understand. If this goes on, it'll ruin me. My reputation, my family, everything I've built. Can't we make some kind of arrangement? Something quiet?" I almost laughed. "You want me to back down now? After you fined me $30,000, harassed my family, tried to put a lien on my house, and dragged me through court?" Her lips trembled. "I made a mistake. I admit that. But if you keep this up, I could lose everything. I'll resign. I'll step down from the board. Just drop the lawsuit. Please." For a flicker of a moment, I saw the woman behind the mask, the fear, the fragility. But then I remembered the letters, the threats, the way she stood in front of the community and tried to humiliate me. "You should have thought about that before you abused your power," I said coldly. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about accountability." Her face hardened again, the old steel returning. "Then you'll regret this," she hissed, before storming back to the SUV. The tires spat gravel as she sped into the night. The next day in court, Caldwell unleashed their desperate gambit. They presented a new witness, an anonymous resident who claimed I had violated HOA rules repeatedly at my main house: unapproved paint colors, lawn violations, improper holiday decorations. The accusations were absurd. Half of them weren't even true. Daniel tore the testimony apart, pointing out inconsistencies and demanding proof that never came. By the end, the so-called witness admitted he had been encouraged by Marjorie to file complaints. It was a last-ditch smear campaign, and it failed spectacularly. Judge Harrington leaned forward, her voice icy. "This court will not tolerate fabricated testimony. Consider this your final warning, Mr. Caldwell." The jury's faces told the rest of the story. They were done with the HOA's games. Meanwhile, the neighborhood revolted. Residents stormed the next home meeting in record numbers, demanding resignations, demanding audits, demanding answers. Some shouted, others wept with frustration. The board tried to maintain order, but without Marjorie's iron grip, chaos reigned. That night, a petition circulated calling for a full recall of the board. Over half the community signed within days. And still, the trial pushed forward toward its conclusion. Daniel prepared me for closing arguments. We've shown their overreach. We've shown corruption, personal bias, financial misconduct. All that's left is to hammer home the bigger picture. This isn't about one cabin. It's about power abused. I nodded, my resolve hard as stone. On the final day, Caldwell delivered his closing with all the polish he could muster. He spoke about community standards, about the need for order. But his voice rang hollow. Even he looked unconvinced by his own words. Then Daniel stood. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is simple at its core. An HOA fined a man $30,000 for a property they had no legal right to control. They ignored their own bylaws. They ignored the limits of their authority. And when challenged, they doubled down with lies, threats, and misuse of community funds. This was not about protecting homeowners. This was about one woman's ego and a board too afraid to stand up to her." He paused, letting the silence settle. "If they can do this to him, they can do it to anyone. That is why this verdict matters. Not just for my client, but for every homeowner who deserves to live free from abuse of power." His words landed like thunder. The jury filed out to deliberate. Hours stretched into what felt like days. My wife squeezed my hand, whispering, "No matter what happens, you stood your ground." Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the verdict slip. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. "We find in favor of the defendant on all counts," he read, "and we award damages in the amount of—" The number that followed made my breath catch. Not only had I won, but the HOA was about to pay dearly for their corruption. The words of the verdict still echoed in my head long after the gavel fell. In favor of the defendant on all counts. Damages awarded. It didn't feel real. For months, I had lived with the crushing weight of threats, fines, lawyers, and fear. Now, the burden was gone, replaced by a surreal lightness. But the shockwave that rolled out from that courtroom was far bigger than me. The jury had awarded me more than just compensation for the bogus $30,000 fine. They awarded punitive damages for harassment, emotional distress, and legal costs. Together, it was a sum large enough to stagger the HOA's finances. Gasps had filled the courtroom when the number was read aloud. I didn't even hear the exact figure at first. My ears were ringing too hard. All I knew was that justice had landed with a thunderclap. Caldwell's face turned white as chalk. He tried to keep his composure, but his knuckles clenched around his legal pad so tight I thought it might crumble. Marjorie, however, looked utterly hollow. Her once fierce glare had dimmed into a blank stare. She sat frozen in her chair, as though she'd just seen her empire collapse in front of her. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "We didn't just win. We burned the house down." Outside, the courthouse steps were packed. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in every direction. Shouts filled the air. "Do you think this verdict will inspire other homeowners to fight back? Do you believe the HOA board should face criminal charges? Are you going to move forward with collecting damages?" I tried to keep my response measured. This wasn't about money. It was about accountability. HOAs should protect communities, not terrorize them. I hope this case encourages others to stand up when they know they're being treated unfairly. Cheers erupted from the crowd of supporters. For the first time, I wasn't just the defendant. I was the symbol of a victory much bigger than one cabin in the woods. But as the celebration spread, the board was imploding. That very evening, 3 members resigned via hastily written emails circulated to residents. One wrote, "I can no longer serve under these conditions or with this leadership. I regret being complicit." Another admitted, "I voted along with Marjorie out of fear. I should have spoken up sooner." Within 48 hours, 5 of the 7 board members had stepped down. Only Marjorie and one loyal ally, Dennis, clung stubbornly to their seats. The neighborhood erupted. A recall petition spread like wildfire, this time not whispered in backyards, but signed openly in driveways, grocery store parking lots, and even outside the elementary school. Residents who once feared retaliation now marched with clipboards, gathering signatures with pride. By week's end, nearly 80% of the neighborhood had demanded a full recall. Meanwhile, the financial side of the judgment hit like a wrecking ball. The HOA's insurance company initially refused to cover the damages, arguing that the board's actions had been deliberate misconduct outside the scope of policy. That meant the money would have to come directly from HOA reserves, or worse, through special assessments on residents. People lost their minds. At an emergency HOA meeting, hundreds of residents crowded into the community center. The air was thick with anger. "You mean to tell us we might have to pay for her mistakes?" One man shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Marjorie. Marjorie stood at the front, trying to maintain her composure. "We're exploring options. If the insurance appeal fails, we may." The crowd roared. "No way! You ruined us! Step down already." One woman, usually quiet, stood with tears in her eyes. "My husband and I can barely afford our mortgage as it is. If you think you're going to take another dime from us because of your ego trip, you're insane." Dennis tried to intervene, banging a gavel on the podium. "Order! Order!" But the room was beyond control. Residents shouted over one another, demanding resignations, demanding audits, demanding police investigations. I stood in the back, arms folded, watching the collapse unfold like a slow-motion landslide. Finally, a man near the front, one of the few who had supported Marjorie in the past, stood up and said, "It's over. You lost. Do the decent thing and resign before you drag us all further down." The room erupted into applause. For the first time, Marjorie's mask cracked. Her shoulders sagged, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked out at the sea of furious neighbors and saw not subjects, but enemies. "I will not be forced out by a mob," she spat, her voice trembling. "This community needs strong leadership, not chaos." But her words only fueled the fire. People booed, shouted, and chanted, "Resign! Resign!" I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The local media devoured every second of the drama. "HOA in meltdown after court defeat," read one headline. "Residents revolt, demanding end to corrupt board," read another. News vans lined the streets. Neighbors gave interviews, telling stories of harassment and petty fines they'd endured for years. What began as my fight over a cabin had exploded into a community-wide rebellion. But the legal consequences were only beginning. 2 weeks later, the county announced that a criminal investigation had been opened into the HOA's financial records. The evidence Daniel had unearthed, misuse of funds, fake votes, manipulated minutes, had caught the attention of prosecutors. The sheriff's department even raided the HOA office, seizing computers, boxes of documents, and hard drives. The footage played on the evening news. Deputies carrying bankers' boxes labeled HOA records, while Marjorie stood outside, pale and tight-lipped, refusing to comment. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had Marjorie siphoned money? Had she funneled HOA funds into her own accounts? Had board members been covering it up? The more people speculated, the worse it got. One night, as I sat on the porch of the cabin with a cup of coffee, Daniel called. "Big news," he said. "The county is preparing to file charges. Fraud, misuse of funds, possibly even perjury from the trial." I exhaled slowly. "So this isn't just civil anymore." "Nope, this is criminal. She's in serious trouble." I stared out into the trees, the night alive with crickets and distant owls. "Funny," I said. "All this started because she wanted to make an example out of me." Daniel chuckled dryly. "And instead, you made an example out of her." But victory brought its own challenges. Residents who once saw me as just that stubborn guy with the cabin now treated me like a hero. People brought over pies, shook my hand at the store, even asked if I'd consider running for the new HOA board once the recall went through. At first, the attention was flattering, but after weeks of it, I started feeling uneasy. I hadn't fought this battle to gain power. I fought it to live in peace. At dinner one night, my wife asked, "Would you ever run?" "You'd be fair. People trust you now." I shook my head. "I don't want to be another Marjorie. I don't want to tell people what color they can paint their doors. I just want to live my life." She smiled softly. "That's why they'd want you." Her words stuck with me, even as I resisted the idea. Meanwhile, Marjorie's life unraveled publicly. Neighbors whispered about foreclosure notices on her house, about her husband leaving town, about creditors circling. Every time she left her driveway, cameras caught her, broadcasting her humiliation to the world. Dennis, her last loyal ally, resigned quietly one evening, posting a single sentence online: "I can no longer serve under current leadership." That left Marjorie entirely alone. And still, she refused to step down. The climax came at the official recall meeting. Hundreds packed into the gymnasium of the local high school. Security officers stood by the doors in case things got heated. On stage, Marjorie stood defiant, clutching the microphone. "I have given years of my life to this community," she declared, her voice trembling with both anger and desperation. "You may not like me, but I kept order. Without me, you'll descend into chaos. Think carefully before you rip apart the foundation of Lakeside Ridge." The boos were deafening. A resident stepped up to the podium with the recall petition. "We've thought carefully," she said firmly, "and we're done." The vote was swift, decisive, and overwhelming. Marjorie was recalled by nearly 90% of residents. For the first time in years, the Queen had fallen. I walked out into the night after the meeting, the cool air filling my lungs. Fireflies danced in the fields. My wife slipped her hand into mine. "It's over," she whispered. I nodded slowly. "For us, maybe. For her, it's just beginning," because I knew the criminal trial was looming. And this time, Marjorie wouldn't just lose her throne. She might lose her freedom. The weeks after the recall felt strangely quiet. For the first time in months, I wasn't checking my mailbox for threatening letters, or fielding calls from Daniel about surprise motions, or watching Marjorie bark orders from a podium. The silence was almost unsettling, like the stillness after a storm before you realize how much debris is left scattered across the ground. Lakeside Ridge was free of Marjorie's rule, but freedom didn't mean peace. The HOA was in shambles. The recalled board left behind chaos, missing records, unpaid invoices, and a budget so mangled it looked like a puzzle dumped onto the floor. The interim leadership committee, formed by a handful of volunteers, scrambled to piece things together. At the first community-wide meeting after the recall, the mood was cautious. Residents filled the folding chairs of the community center, murmuring nervously. Some carried notebooks. Others clutched coffee cups like lifelines. A man named Victor, a retired accountant who'd volunteered to help stabilize things, stood at the front with a projector screen. He tapped a stack of papers nervously against the podium. "We've begun reviewing the HOA's books," he said, "and, well, what we found so far is deeply concerning." He clicked the remote, and numbers filled the screen. Tens of thousands in undocumented expenses, checks written without signatures, consulting fees paid to companies that don't exist, and in several cases, withdrawals made directly to board members' personal accounts. Gasps spread through the room. People shook their heads, muttering angrily. "Where did it go?" someone demanded. "Are you saying they stole from us?" shouted another. Victor hesitated. "I'm saying the county investigators were right to open a criminal case. We've already turned over everything we've found. But make no mistake, what Marjorie and her allies did wasn't just bad management. It was theft." The room erupted. The following week, the headlines confirmed it. Former HOA president indicted on fraud charges. County prosecutors filed 12 counts against Lakeside Ridge leadership. Marjorie, once the self-styled queen of the neighborhood, was now facing the fight of her life. The charges included embezzlement, wire fraud, falsifying documents, and even perjury for lies she told under oath during my trial. Dennis and two other former board members were also named, though with lesser charges. The morning news showed footage of Marjorie being led into court in handcuffs. Her hair was disheveled, her once impeccable suits replaced by a plain gray blazer. Cameras zoomed in on her tight-lipped scowl as reporters shouted questions. "Marjorie, do you have anything to say to the residents you stole from? Do you regret fining homeowners unfairly? Are you afraid you'll go to prison?" She said nothing. I watched the broadcast from my cabin, sipping coffee. My wife sat beside me, shaking her head. "Think she'll plead out?" she asked. I shrugged. "Marjorie doesn't admit defeat. She'll fight to the bitter end." And she did. Her defense attorney, not Caldwell this time, but a cheaper replacement, tried to paint her as a victim of poor accounting practices and misunderstood authority. They claimed she had acted in good faith, that she had merely misinterpreted HOA bylaws. But prosecutors came armed with a mountain of evidence. Emails where she openly discussed making an example of me, bank records showing money funneled into her personal account, testimonies from former board members who finally turned on her to save themselves. The most damning piece was a recording Helen, the former secretary, had secretly kept. In it, Marjorie could be heard ordering her to rewrite the minutes to erase dissenting votes. Her voice was cold, commanding. "No one needs to know what they actually said. The board agrees with me. That's how it will read." When the recording played in court, the jury's faces tightened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Marjorie glared daggers at Helen from across the courtroom. But Helen sat straight-backed, unflinching. Meanwhile, Lakeside Ridge was struggling to rebuild. The interim committee decided to hold elections for a brand new board. Flyers went out. Candidates posted their names. For the first time, there was a sense of possibility, a chance to create an HOA that actually served the community instead of ruling over it. Neighbors I barely knew began knocking on my door, asking if I would run. "You're the reason we're free of her," one man told me. "We trust you. You stood up when nobody else would," a woman said. "You'd be the perfect president," but every time I shook my head. I didn't fight this battle to take her place. I just want to be left alone. Still, the pressure grew. My wife teased me about it at dinner. "You keep saying no, but they're not going to stop asking. Maybe you should think about it." I sighed. I don't want the power. That's exactly what corrupted Marjorie. People like me were better off outside the board. But deep down, I wondered if refusing meant leaving the door open for another Marjorie to rise. Back in court, Marjorie's trial stretched on for weeks. The prosecution built their case piece by piece, showing the jury how she had twisted the HOA into her own weapon, using fines as tools of intimidation, bleeding the treasury dry for her own gain, silencing anyone who dared oppose her. And all the while, Marjorie's temper flared. She snapped at her lawyer. She rolled her eyes at the jury. She whispered venom at witnesses under her breath. One afternoon, during cross-examination, the prosecutor asked her directly, "Did you believe you had the right to fine the defendant for a cabin outside HOA jurisdiction?" "Yes," Marjorie shot back, her voice sharp. "I had the right to do whatever was necessary to maintain standards. If he had gotten away with it, others would have followed." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "So you admit you acted outside the written bylaws?" Marjorie's face flushed. She stammered. "The bylaws were guidelines. I was the authority." That single sentence sealed her fate. The jury deliberated only 2 days. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict in a steady voice. Guilty on all counts. Marjorie's knees buckled. For a moment, it looked like she might faint. Her lawyer caught her arm, whispering frantically. The judge set sentencing for a month later. Until then, Marjorie was released on bond, but with her passport confiscated and strict limits on travel. The news exploded again. "HOA Queen guilty," the headlines screamed. Residents celebrate justice. That night, fireworks lit up the neighborhood sky, not official, just neighbors setting them off in their yards, laughing and cheering. It felt like Independence Day had come early. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Residents filled every bench. Reporters crowded the aisles. Deputies stood guard at the doors. Marjorie shuffled in, her once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her face pale. Judge Harrington addressed her sternly. "Mrs. Simmons, you were entrusted with leadership. Instead, you abused your authority for personal gain, inflicted harm on those you were meant to serve, and showed no remorse. This court has no choice but to impose a significant sentence." She paused, the silence heavy. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to the residents of Lakeside Ridge." Gasps filled the room. Some cheered. Others wept. Marjorie's face crumpled. She tried to speak, but no words came. Deputies led her away in handcuffs, her head bowed. Just like that, the reign of Marjorie was truly over. But even as she disappeared behind bars, Lakeside Ridge was left with scars. At the next HOA election, turnout was higher than anyone could remember. People who had never cared about board politics before now stood in line to vote, determined to keep another tyrant from rising. Victor, the retired accountant, was elected president by a landslide. His campaign promise was simple: transparency, accountability, and service to residents. He was no politician, no grand speaker, just a man with integrity. And that was exactly what the community needed. When the results were announced, cheers echoed through the streets. For the first time in years, Lakeside Ridge felt like a neighborhood again, not a kingdom. I returned to my cabin that night, the quiet of the woods wrapping around me like a blanket. I sat on the porch with my wife, sipping coffee under the stars. "It's really over," she whispered. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, for Marjorie, it's over. For us, it's just beginning again." Because the truth was, the battle had changed me. I wasn't just a man who wanted to be left alone anymore. I had seen firsthand what happens when people abuse power unchecked. And though I still didn't want to lead, I knew I'd never sit back in silence again. The cabin stood quiet, steady, timeless, a symbol of everything I had fought for. A reminder that sometimes one person standing their ground is enough to topple a tyrant. But deep down, I knew there was still one more chapter left, because while Marjorie was gone, the lessons of her downfall would shape the neighborhood for years to come. The day after Marjorie was sentenced, Lakeside Ridge woke up to a different kind of mourning. For the first time in years, there were no threats of letters stuffed in mailboxes, no tense glares exchanged at driveways, no fear that an innocuous choice like planting the wrong flowers might trigger a fine. The neighborhood, once a place of constant tension, felt lighter. But healing takes time, and wounds like ours weren't going to vanish overnight. In the weeks that followed, the newly elected HOA board got to work. Victor, the retired accountant turned reluctant president, led with quiet determination. He and his fellow board members opened every meeting to the public, published budgets online, and invited residents to vote on issues big and small. The change was palpable. Instead of Marjorie's sharp voice commanding obedience, the new board meetings buzzed with conversation. People who had avoided HOA gatherings for years now showed up eagerly, coffee cups in hand, talking about landscaping, holiday events, and neighborhood watch patrols. "Feels like we finally have a say," one neighbor told me. Another added, "It's not just about rules anymore. It's about community." For the first time since moving here, Lakeside Ridge felt like the kind of place I had hoped it would be. Still, Marjorie's shadow lingered. The county sheriff's office continued investigating, tracing the trail of missing funds. Restitution payments began trickling back into the HOA account, but the damage was deep. It would take years to fully repair the financial harm. Some neighbors whispered about suing Marjorie personally for damages beyond what the court had ordered. Others debated whether the community should forgive and move on. But forgiveness was hard to come by. The memory of her iron grip, of the humiliation and fear, still ran too deep. I would sometimes catch myself remembering the nights I sat in my cabin, heart pounding, wondering if her threats would escalate further. Even in victory, those scars lingered. One afternoon, I walked the neighborhood with my wife. Kids played tag in the cul-de-sac, their laughter ringing through the air. A group of neighbors planted flowers along the entrance, chatting happily as they worked. It was the kind of simple, ordinary day we had longed for. A neighbor stopped us, holding a clipboard. "We're organizing a block party next month. Would you two like to help?" My wife smiled warmly. "We'd love to." And just like that, we found ourselves drawn back into the rhythm of community, not the oppressive control Marjorie had wielded, but the genuine connection that had been buried beneath her rule. The local news eventually moved on. New scandals, new stories pushed ours off the headlines. But every now and then, a journalist would call, asking for a quote about the HOA case that changed everything. Some even referred to it as the Lakeside Ridge precedent, a case study for homeowners across the state who wanted to challenge unfair HOA practices. Daniel told me one day, "You don't realize it yet, but your case is already being cited in other lawsuits." You gave people hope. The idea stunned me. I hadn't set out to become an example. I just wanted to protect my cabin, my peace. And yet that small fight had rippled outward, changing far more than I ever expected. But the biggest change was inside me. Before all this, I thought of myself as someone who just wanted to be left alone. I hated conflict. I avoided politics. I believed keeping my head down was the best way to live. Marjorie changed that. She taught me that silence only empowers bullies. That sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting everyone who can't or won't fight back. I realized that courage doesn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like sitting across from a lawyer, or testifying in court, or simply refusing to back down when you know you're right. The new board elections came around again a year later. This time, neighbors urged me even harder to run. "You don't have to be president," Victor told me. "Just a board member. Someone we can trust to keep things honest." For weeks, I wrestled with the decision. I still craved my peace, my cabin, the quiet of the woods. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that people were right. If good people refused to lead, bad people would always fill the gap. On the final day of nominations, I surprised even myself. I put my name down for a board seat, not because I wanted power, but because I had learned what happens when power goes unchecked. Election night came, and I was voted in with overwhelming support. At the first meeting, I sat at the long folding table with the rest of the board. The crowd of residents looked at us, not with fear, but with trust. And when Victor called the meeting to order, I felt a strange mix of nerves and pride. We weren't there to rule. We were there to serve. And in that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't about tearing down the HOA. It was about rebuilding it into something better. Months passed. Life returned to normal, though it was a new kind of normal, one where residents spoke freely, where kids rode bikes without fear of a violation letter, where the board focused on safety and upkeep instead of power and punishment. The cabin became a gathering place. Neighbors visited on weekends, sharing stories around the fire pit. What once had been a symbol of conflict was now a symbol of resilience. Sometimes, sitting on the porch with my wife, I would look out at the woods and think back to that first letter from Marjorie, the one that demanded I pay $30,000 for daring to exist outside her reach. How far we had come. As for Marjorie, she served her sentence quietly. News trickled in from time to time, rumors of her appealing, of her health failing, of her family moving away. But she was no longer our concern. Her empire was gone. Her legacy was one of caution, a reminder burned into the memory of Lakeside Ridge. Never again. The last time I walked into a community meeting, I looked around the room and saw something I hadn't seen in years: unity. Neighbors of all backgrounds laughing, debating, sharing ideas. No fear. No intimidation. Victor caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. It was a nod of thanks, of solidarity. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just my victory. It belonged to everyone who had lived under her shadow, everyone who had signed petitions, everyone who had raised their voice when it was hard to do so. The fight had started with me, but it had ended with us. Now, when I sit at the cabin porch in the quiet evenings, I don't hear echoes of fear anymore. I hear laughter from neighbors down the hill. I hear kids riding bikes along the gravel path. I hear the rustle of leaves in the breeze, untouched, unclaimed by anyone's authority but nature's. The cabin is still mine, still outside their jurisdiction, still the place where it all began. But more than that, it is a monument to resilience, a reminder that even in the face of corruption, even when the odds feel stacked, one person's refusal to bend can change everything. And so, life moves on, not with the silence of surrender, but with the harmony of a community finally free. Because in the end, justice wasn't just served in a courtroom. It was served in every driveway, every front porch, every quiet moment where people could finally live without fear. That was the real victory. And that was the legacy of the fight we won.